For all of you, we start each of the meetings in Bank Australia, and I learned this when we held the GABV Leaders Conference in Australia, with an acknowledgement of traditional owners. And it's really impressive to see that on all the web pages of Bank Australia, it begins like this. At Bank Australia, we respectfully acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the lands on which we work and pay our respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging. Our head office is located on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. We recognize their continued connection to the land, waters, and culture, and we acknowledge their sovereignty has never been ceded. We also acknowledge the constant resistance and resilience of First Nations people in their fight for self-determination. He further goes on to say, we support the Uluru Statement from the heart to achieve justice, recognition, and respect for First Nations people, and the referendum to enshrine a First Nations voice in the Constitution. He's very forward-thinking. We see reconciliation as a fundamental responsibility for Bank Australia, and we are committed to advancing reconciliation with Australia's First Peoples. I must say, since our meeting, Damien, putting together acknowledgement of traditional owners has gone around the world. So I'm really delighted that this all started with the work that we are doing with your bank. I mean, there's so much to say about Australia itself, but I want to get into the questions as we begin the interview. First, about you, Damien. What have been some of your milestones up to now that have led you to the role that you're at as the managing director? So just a little bit of history about you.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Probably three things that I'd like to touch on is, interestingly, I've been privileged to work in financial cooperatives my whole adult life. So, and that's the history of the organisation that I'm in today. So it's been, as you mentioned, over 30 years working in financial cooperatives, started out in credit unions and friendly societies. So that's been a really wonderful part of my journey. I think also, secondly, I've come across some amazing leaders in my journey where they've singled me out and either coached or mentored me and assisted me in my journey. And that's been hugely powerful in terms of shaping my approach to leadership, but also the understanding, I think, fairly early on that I needed to invest in my own personal development. And so doing an undergraduate degree and then a number of postgraduate studies has been really helpful to me in terms of developing my own career path. And I've worked in an industry that's gone through a lot of consolidation, so a number of mergers. My bank, 65 years in the making, has had 72 mergers, and I've been part of some of those mergers. And I think that my history in the industry, the investment people have made in me, but also the investment I've made myself has helped me to forge a career path through that consolidation and merger transformation history. Yeah.
And one thing you've learned from one of your elders that we can pass on?
Oh, wow. A good question, and not on notice. So
yeah.
I think for me, it was a CEO in the early days who actually encouraged me to go and do some further studies. It was that challenge around investing in your own personal development, I think, that spurred me on in terms of understanding that, the world didn't owe me anything. I had to actually make that investment in myself to be able to forge a career. And that was something that was a very, very personal agenda for me. Yeah.
Beautiful. I was unprepared. Just wanted to hear that, just to get a little bit personal in our discussion. If we go to the bank itself, it feels that you're working to live your values every day. Can you give some examples about how that finds its way into the bank systems and processes and culture and people?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think that culturally, our ownership structure around being a financial cooperative, so started life as a credit union, it's in the DNA of the organisation. So our customers hold us to account, our people hold us to account, our governing board is very committed to the values, the mission, the purpose of the organisation. So it's part of every discussion in terms of, you know, having the customer at the centre of the business and driving positive outcomes for them because they're the owners of the organisation, but also around how we help drive a positive agenda in terms of transforming towards sustainable development. And often that requires conversations that are more challenging. Sometimes they're in the grey, there's not black and white decisions, but it's part of the history of the organisation. And if we have a moment, I kind of would like to share that with you. Yeah.
Please.
So it started in 1957 as CSIRO Employees Credit Union, which was the federal government science agency. And as I said, over the last 65 years, we've had 72 mergers. But we had a merger in 1998 that I was involved in. It was a three-way merger of the Science Credit Union, Aviation Credit Union, and Energy Credit Union. And it was through that three-way merger in 98 that we came through that very difficult process into the early 2000s, got through Y2K. You're young enough or old enough to remember that, Tom. But there was a bit of an identity crisis because why did we exist? Our original purpose and the original reason why those founding credit unions were formed was to address a social need, which was around access to affordable credit. And there was a gap or a failure in the market that credit unions addressed at that time. But fast forward to the early 2000s, that market failure no longer existed. There was ready access to credit. We were supplying a commodity product. We were competing on price and on service, but that wasn't driving a competitive advantage. So I think it was that merger and that almost crisis of identity that made us think more deeply about why do we exist and what's our purpose in a contemporary modern world, and look towards the Northern Hemisphere in particular and saw this emerging theme around sustainable development and thought, actually, that's really interesting because we could repurpose our cooperative ownership structure, but for a contemporary audience and attract a much younger demographic because we had an aging customer base. But tap into that sense around social and environmental issues. This is before ESG was, you know, a common knowledge or trend. And that was kind of fascinating for us because it really felt that it could resonate with the business that we owned and operated, but also attract a socially aware, you know, consumer or target market to the business. And 2003, we had another merger, but the CEO at that time gave us license to explore that opportunity. And so I think that was really the turning point for us as a business. So what am I saying in a short story? It's been a 20-year journey since the early 2000s to get to where we are today. And that's been a really interesting learning journey. We've certainly not got everything right along the way. We've made some mistakes, but I think it's been really powerful because as we've joined the Global Alliance and we've informed our thinking and tested and learned, we've actually got far more confident in who we are as an organisation, and our values and our mission, our purpose has simply got stronger as a result.
Really interesting. And I want to dig in a little bit before we move forward on the questions to that crux point where you said that turning point. And I'm really curious, did it just go like that, or did you really have to make the case? Because I always feel in those moments there's resistance as well.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, we we started that thinking in the early 2000s, but the merger in 2003 was a bit of a risk because whilst our thinking was sound, it wasn't fully formed, and the premise that we brought to the new merged entity was not tested, not proven. There was definitely resistance, and the funny thing was in the industry of credit unions and mutual banks in Australia, when we started to push into sustainable development as core to our strategy, core to our being and our existence, there were many in the industry that kind of laughed at us a little bit. You know, we were these greenies or tree-hugging, you know, bankers off to the left somewhere, and it took some time to win them over. And it's interesting now because 20 years later, we're often referred to as being ahead of the curve and had read the zeitgeist in terms of where society was moving. And it was really because we looked to the Northern Hemisphere and we could see that trend was emerging, and it was something that resonated with us. But it took a while, I think, for it to resonate in Australia.
Yet you persisted, and I think this is really interesting because when I hear your story, it seems that you've anticipated many of the changes in society, both on the social side and on the climate side. And but that doesn't just mean that there's bold thinking. Again, how you embed that, how you get that in the organization. Can you give us a sense of a few of those steps, a few of those learnings?
Yeah, interestingly, I have a wonderful board, you know, governing board, and I think, you know, professional directors who come from all walks of life and experience, so really diverse thinking, which is wonderful, but they kind of get it. They get the opportunity that exists for us in the market, but they also get the, if you want to change finance, you really have to finance change and really address human needs and contemporary issues, whether that's social justice or environmental issues. And to be able to use banking, which is core to an economy, you know, it really is core to the way that money moves and power moves around the system, that we could use the business of banking to have a huge impact, even though we're a small bank, but have a huge impact in our market to influence the system, but also drive positive change for our customer owners. That's hugely powerful because the directors, they set the tone from the top. They actually respectfully challenge management. They ask really interesting questions. They don't always make life easy for us, but I think it's that, you know, constructive tension between a governing board and an executive body that if you get that right, that's hugely powerful because again, it goes back to that confidence thing, that if you can see the strategies working and you empower your people to execute on that strategy and explore the opportunity in the market, then yeah, that's a really wonderful place to be in.
And that's personified, of course, in Judith Downs, who we all know well from the Governing Board Forum. She's so capable and smart, and just able to bear down on the right questions at the right moment. That's fantastic. I would like to show a little clip that helps us to tee up the conversation about the brand. And I'm wondering, Jessica, if you can help us with that now, this was one of the first ads that you had for the new brand.
What are our dollars doing right this minute? Every single one of us needs to think about our purchases, our investments, our banks, everything that we do that can influence our money. Because at the other end of that money, people and places are suffering. Ignoring that is wrong.
Beautiful. And Joel Solomon, so this is a good example of something that you saw in the world and you were able to bring it, but you've done more than that. You've actually completely rebranded, and I felt it was such an audacious thing to just declare Bank Australia. And can you talk about that process, that change?
Yeah, so Tom, you might remember the Global Alliance. We hosted the Global Alliance in Melbourne in 2014, and it was really fascinating for me to join the Alliance because that happened in 2012 in Vancouver in Canada, hosted by Van City at the time. And I found my tribe, I found my people in that forum. These were other bankers that were seeking to drive positive outcomes and change in the communities where they operated. And hosting the Alliance in 2014 helped us to further our thinking, but also really build confidence about who we are and our mission, our vision, and our values. So part of that thinking led us to change our name and our brand in 2015 to Bank Australia. And we did a domestic and global search and IP process to make sure that no one would challenge us around the name, Bank Australia, because it was a big name for a small bank. But also what was really important to us was not so much about the name, although we felt that we had a good name, was that it was the values, and it was always about how we attach the values to the brand and then speak to those values. And I think for us, what was really critical, again, as being a small bank, is that we were hidden from the market. We were not at all visible, particularly to our target market of socially aware consumers. So committing significant financial dollars to rebranding, becoming very public about our mission, our vision, our values and our purpose, but then being able to initiate an advertising campaign across social media, traditional media, so television, billboards, outdoor advertising. And that was, we were the first in Australia to really wear our values on our sleeve and speak to our purpose and our mission in that public domain in a way that in some ways it polarised people. There were some people that really didn't like us, and that was okay because they weren't our customers that we were speaking to, or the future customers of the organisation. But those that we attracted, which were skewed to a younger demographic. I mean, socially aware people are of all ages and backgrounds and walks of life, but certainly skewed to a younger demographic, and that helped attract new customers to the business. And that's been hugely powerful because we've had significant growth though since 2015, particularly the last 3 or 4 years. But it's also brought a cohort of new co-workers to the organisation who really want to be part of driving change and part of working for an organisation that has a really positive agenda and that aligns with their mission in life and their values. So in some ways it's really interesting because whilst it does polarise people, and there are some who will never be part of our organisation or our customers, those that do want to be part of positive change, gosh, that's powerful. Like, that seriously is, it just drives the business forward. And it was a little interesting, but the start of the pandemic in 2020 was one of our, we thought, everything was coming to an end in terms of the challenges we would face as a business. But, we grew very, very strongly and doubled our profit in that period, and have been able to, leverage that moment in time to really help our customers through a very, very challenging period of time, but also, help our staff through that period of time. And I think that's been hugely rewarding, and it speaks to the values of the organisation. So it's not just advertising, it's just not a media campaign, it's really grounded in the DNA and the culture of the business.
If you think of a moment or time in that period, the period of after you launched the brand, you got it underway, where the effect surprised you or had an impact in a way that you didn't expect. Does anything come to mind?
So two, one not so positive and one really positive. So the one that was not so positive, you might remember late 2019, early 2020, there were very major bushfires across the eastern seaboard of Australia, and the impacts of climate change were becoming very visible to people living across the eastern seaboard, where the bulk of our population is, in the cities of Brisbane and Sydney and Canberra and Melbourne, but also across regional Australia. And the sentiment changed at that point. People really were starting to make a connection between the way that our economies were running, you know, our use of energy, our consumption, and the human effects around climate change. So that was a disaster. It was a terrible disaster. I know you saw footage of the fires in Europe and North America and around the globe, but it galvanised people to really think about the role that money plays in society and the power and the agency they have to choose about where they place their money, whether that's in a pension fund or a bank or insurer. So that there was a wave of new customers that came out as a result of tragedy, and it's not how you want to grow, but it was a surprise. And you asked the question, was it a surprise? The other one, which was really interesting and a surprise as well, is that we had some social influencers, you know, on social media who actually start to voluntarily promote our brand and our values to their audience. Again, socially aware people, but these were not individuals that we had any relationship with. That, I mean, they were customers, but we were not paying them. They were not paid promoters for us as an organisation. But there's this whole generation that lives on social media that were being exposed to the bank through the influences that they engage with. And that was interesting because it surprised us, but B, it wasn't something we can manage. So it has risks attached to it. It can either be good or it can be bad. So you better be ready for any bad outcomes. So they were two things that were kind of almost unintended consequences of us rebranding, being very, very visible about who we are and what we stand for.
Yeah, I can imagine that really made a difference. I want to encourage everyone who's listening today to feel free to put your questions in the chat so we can have a chance to hear from you as well. I'm going to continue on though with a few more questions just as we continue. So my sense is that the change in the brand made a difference for you. What was the chicken and egg there? Was it the brand that changes the way you behave, or was there already something in the way you're behaving that became the brand?
No, it was the latter. There was something about the way we were behaving that ultimately became the brand. So it was very much informed by that identity crisis around the year 2000 and thinking about how do we repurpose a really, unique, valuable business that it's around lineage. It's around how you create wealth and then pass that on through to the next generation, but whilst having a positive impact in the communities where you operate. And for us, that's also about, creating employment opportunities in regional Australia around helping, to improve the outcomes for our Indigenous First Nations people in terms of their self-determination, and I think that's really something that's very important to us as an Australian bank is our role that we play in that particular part of the market. But interestingly, because we do survey our customers around what are the top sort of 10 social environmental issues that they want us to act upon, and climate change is the number one issue. It is by far the largest issue or most pressing issue that they want us to use the business of banking to help solve in terms of action on climate. And that's not just us as a business, but how we help them in terms of how they might electrify their homes and move to renewable energy, to come off the coal-fired grid in Australia. And the long tail for us will be how we how we help our customers shift off fossil gas, often referred to as natural gas, but it is a transition fuel, but it's one that's going to be the long tail for us in Australia as we move through to clean energy.
Mm-hmm. I want to go back to this point about Lineage, because I think this is really a difference for your bank. As you think also about acknowledgement of traditional owners, that feels like Lineage to me. Can you make this distinction between lineage and legacy? Because it feels different.
You know, I learnt it from you, Tom, so I'll be quoting you.
Oh, I'm very interested in this point. So, yeah.
Yeah. So you can do the whole Zen thing. I'll do the Damien version.
Okay.
It's funny because I'd always talked about this business as a legacy business. You know, we've got a generation of Australians who created this bank back in the 1950s, and they've created wealth and capital in the organisation. And as a cooperative enterprise, you know, effectively you pass that on to the next generation. And as leaders, we're part of that process. So we've got a duty of care. You know, we're accountable to our customers who are our shareholders. And we really, I think, feel that quite deeply in the business that, you know, we're stewards of our customers' money, and they place a great deal of trust in us as a business. But you taught me in Washington just recently that perhaps there's a different perspective to apply around lineage, and that's not just creating a legacy for the next generation to take forward, but how you then pass on that culture, the values, the DNA in the organisation, because that's what grounds the business in addressing human needs and addressing social justice, environmental justice. And I think that lineage is really important. So I'm going to now hand back to you, Tom, and ask you a question.
Sure.
What was your insights or learnings around lineage versus legacy?
I think you've got it. I think the one thing is to understand that we're really only here for a very short period of time as leaders, and that somehow we are picking up a baton and carrying and handing a baton over, and that quite often I see that people want to rush to get everything done within that time frame of their career or their life. And somehow it calms me back down to know that we're also in the job of developing people who are going to pick up the baton. So to me, but I like the way you also frame the legacy. It is really both in the way you describe it. So I appreciate that very much. There are a few comments. Meta said, I get so inspired from hearing your story, Damien. Thank you for sharing and making the sustainability work feel worthwhile, because it's possible to drive change. And Lars Persson, hello, Lars. Very impressive. Thank you, Damien. Do you expect some changes coming after recent elections which may impact or support your activities? Also in terms of climate, where Australia has been lagging behind a bit.
Yeah. Thanks, Lars. Good to have the question from you. I haven't seen you for some years. I hope you're doing well. It was interesting, as some of you may know, we've had a change of government at the federal level in Australia, but a number of our Conservative politicians lost their seats to independents, and I'm talking about seats that were very, very safe seats. So to have independent people challenge them was interesting in the first place, but the fact that they actually were able to win a significant number of those seats was quite a surprise for many. And so what was the difference? I think those that were the politicians in the Conservative seats had become tone deaf to their constituency. The independents that stood against them addressed a key number of, a small number of issues. It was typically about 2 or 3 issues. And the main issue was around action on climate change. And the challenge in the Australian political system, and to where we've been lagging behind, which is Lars' point, is that action on climate change had become politicised. So neither party, whether it was the left-wing party or the right-wing party, could break that nexus around the politicisation of climate change, particularly when a large part of our economy is around the extraction and export industry. So that was a challenge for both political parties in our sort of dual party system. And the interesting thing, I think, and it's important to say this, is that we've got compulsory voting in Australia. So whilst you have a left-wing party and a right-wing party, they both get pushed to the centre simply because the vast majority of Australians vote. And so we've had centrist governments over a long period of time, but they've become tone deaf to concerns that Australian citizens had. And I spoke about the terrible, terrible fires that we had back in late 2019 and early 2020, when Australians really started to make a connection between climate change and the impact that it was going to have on our country. And I think that finally got through, so that the independents were able to tap into that sentiment and drive that change at a political level. But for us, I think that's really positive, because it also means that what we're seeing across Australia is that our niche, which was around socially aware consumers, and maybe 20 years ago it was quite a small niche, is actually growing as the whole country becomes more progressive, more socially aware, as people become more conscious around the impacts of climate change. And we've had some terrible floods in the last 6 months or so. I think that what we're seeing is our addressable market's actually becoming larger and larger, and it's becoming mainstream. So that's the opportunity in front of us.
That sounds really, really positive. What strikes me is that from the point of view of it's positive because of the challenges that you're facing in society, that people now realize that you're on the right track. Where do you feel like you're really making a difference as a bank?
Gosh.
And where do we start? I think that's the question.
Where do we start? Yeah. Gosh, and there's so many areas. I really like the work that we do around conservation and biodiversity. So for those in the audience that don't know, we think we're the only bank in the world that actually owns conservation land. So we started off with 200 hectares back in 2008, and it's now over 2,000 hectares of land in a remote part of Western Victoria. It's very arid land. It butts onto a desert area. So I'm talking, it's not productive farmland. It's very arid land. And we worked with Trust for Nature to put it under a conservation reserve. So if we were to ever sell it, it always has to remain as conservation land. And we work with an organisation called Greening Australia to rehabilitate the land. And that's been quite phenomenal in terms of the work that we've been able to do around reintroducing native species, thinking about climate adaptation as that change occurs across the Australian landscape, what sort of seeds we might plant from further north, bring them down into the southern regions. Work with the local Indigenous groups to do cultural surveys, to do cultural burns on the land, but also support a traineeship for a young Indigenous person to learn about land management, and that interaction between Western science-based conservation and Indigenous knowledge, and how we bring that to life. I think that's really hugely powerful, and that's probably one of the things that I've been hugely proud of, because it's very unique. We haven't seen that replicated anywhere else in the world, but it connects and tells our story with so many people. And we engage with academia, we engage with government at different levels, and different people about the work we're doing around conservation and biodiversity, and that really resonates with us as a business. So that's one that I've been I think a strength for us as an organisation.
Well, and for those who don't know, Australia is the driest of any continent on Earth except Antarctica.
Yeah.
That's one I remembered. And but going to the Aboriginal people, I was surprised to read that while Aboriginal people have been around for 50,000 years, they only make up 1.5% of your total population. And it feels like it's so precious, that group of people. I know you're doing a lot of work in that space as well with those folks.
So it might be a little bit more than 1.5% now, which is a great
That
thing.
would be good.
Yeah, look, for me, what's really exciting at the moment in terms of Indigenous development and reconciliation is what's known as the Uluru Statement from the Heart. So Indigenous elders from around the country some years ago met in Central Australia at a place where the colonist term is Ayers Rock, but has been renamed or decolonised, and it's known as Uluru. And they put together this is my language, but it's not the right language, but a manifesto to seek recognition for Indigenous persons in the Australian Constitution. So interestingly, no treaty was established with our First Nations people during the colonisation process. They're not recognised in our Constitution. In actual fact, terra nullius was the order of the day during the original colonisation, which meant that the land was empty, so there was no recognition of First Nation peoples at all, which was different from, you know, colonisation in New Zealand or Canada or America. So establishing a treaty with our First Nations people is really important. That's going to take a long time, perhaps, you know, a decade or so. Recognising our First Nations people in the Constitution. The new government has sought within 12 months to bring a referendum to change the Constitution. And I think, you know, Australians are peoples who want to, in colloquial terms, you know, a fair go. And I think that would get support. I think also creating an Indigenous voice in Parliament is really important. And that's something that's, it's called a makarrata, but it's how we create an Indigenous voice in Parliament so that we're recognising our First Nations people as we make laws and legislation. And I think also what's really important, and we've seen other, you know, countries go through this process, is a Truth and Reconciliation Commission or Truth and Justice Commission, because I think our First Nations people need their stories to be heard. And these are you know, very, very challenging conversations, but very important for us culturally, I think, as a nation. You're on mute, Tom.
Thanks. Just, it's really remarkable, Damien, the dedication, the time, the effort you put into this. And I've seen that for, you know, the 10 years that I've known you, longer. So I think it has to do with what you pay attention to as well. James Niven asks a question, first saying that it's inspiring how you've embedded value so deeply into the business, and thank you. You mentioned some of the mistakes that you made in the interview, and what is the mistake that maybe you learned the most from, and what did it teach you? If you can think back on those times of the rebranding. And
James, thanks very much. Mistakes that I've learned from. I think, interestingly, we have a role around advocacy, but the line between advocacy and activism can be a bit blurred from time to time. And your customers and your co-workers always want you to do better. They always want you to have a greater voice and to address a whole range of social justice or environmental issues. And there are times when we've inadvertently slipped into activism, and I think that hasn't gone well for us. And we've learned from that. So I think that's been hugely important for us, because as a bank, you know, our primary role is around the provision of banking services. But also, I think as a responsible bank, we do have a role around advocacy and how we seek to drive positive change. But not being engaged in that activist space, I think, is also important, because we're a regulated institution. We've got a very serious role to play in society. So I think that that's important. I'll give another little slightly different story. We had some segments of conservative media or conservative parts of the Australian economy that have criticised us from time to time. So either on the front page of a national newspaper or in a Senate inquiry, so in our upper house in the federal government, almost on a name and shame basis. And the funny thing about that is the reverse has been the outcome, in that it's actually resonated with our target market of socially aware people, and probably driven greater brand advertising and recognition for us, in that, we stand by our values. And like I said, we've got to be open and transparent and accountable. We don't always get it right, but it's important that we own who we are. And sometimes when we've been called out in the conservative parts of Australian economy and media, what it's done is help actually elevate our brand and reach out to our target market. So there's a positive outcome of perhaps some negative attention.
It sounds like one way or another good. It's news, and it can be good in any way you look at it, but still there's that tricky line, as you say, between the activist stance and the advocacy stance. Really interesting. Could you elaborate a little bit on Australia and the world? Started to touch on this a bit, and the rest of the Asia Pacific region, especially the role of China. And how do you relate to the shifts that are underway in the world as a mission-led bank, as a purpose-led bank?
Yeah, it's interesting in the Asia Pacific region, because sustainable development's becoming elevated across a lot of our neighbours in the region. So in the Pacific area, it might be the low-lying nations that are looking at coastal inundation and other challenges around climate change. In Southeast Asia, when you think about the food bowl countries like India, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, etc. Again, the impacts of climate change around production of food and how they feed the region, or even feed the globe in that sense, is becoming, more contemporary issues for them. When you're dealing with, floods or changes in the seasons and how that's sort of impacting agriculture and farming. So it's interesting too, I think, in that area, when you think about a lot of the focus for our member banks in that area is around social justice and helping lift communities out of poverty. But there's very strong connections now around climate justice and social justice, and how they're impacting on people in those economies. So yeah, I think working with our neighbours in the region, particularly other members of the Global Alliance, about how we address a range of social and environmental issues is only going to become more important, because we are interconnected. That's the reality of a modern world. And you mentioned China, and China is our largest trading partner, and I think it's really important that we have a constructive working relationship with China in the region, and how we focus on sustainable development, and because our relationships are not always positive and not always constructive, and that, I think, can damage both sides of the party, so to speak. But I mean of the countries. But clearly, and I'll come back to climate because it's such a global issue, but it does require collaboration. It does require connection. It does require all governments seeking to address their commitments around Paris in 2020, 2050 rather, net zero commitments. And I think as companies or organisations, we have roles to play, as well as supporting our governments in terms of addressing social and environmental issues, particularly in our region.
Maybe this is just again a side question. As I think about, you kind of keyed to me when you're really talking about legislation and things happening in other places in the world. We also, within the Global Alliance, want to take an advocacy stance, sometimes a little bit of an activist stance. And I'm wondering, in this change finance, given that we're more than 300 billion in assets, that we're many co-workers around the world, what are your highest hopes for what the GABV can be for you as a bank and for the rest of the banking system?
Yeah, it's interesting, Tom, because that conversation is quite live in our business. But for me, I really want to see sustainable development become mainstream. What I'm hugely excited about is that the major banks in Australia can influence change and have an impact at a scale that we can't. At an institutional level, the investments that they can make in the clean energy transition is hugely powerful. So whilst there might be some people, within the Global Alliance or within our own bank who think that it's a threat that mainstream finance pushes into our area and our focus around sustainable development, in actual fact, I think that's kind of the goal. That's the aim, that if we can actually make green finance central to the finance system, or sustainable development central to the finance system, so that it works for human needs, then that's job done from my perspective. I think that's a really positive outcome for people and planet.
Thank you. Florian is asking a question. He said, thanks for a very interesting discussion. Do you think the current trend of financial regulations actually help smaller or values-based banks, or is the regulatory environment getting more and more difficult to sustain with time? And I'll add to that, what are some strategies for dealing with that, engaging with that?
Thanks, Florian. Yeah, it's a challenge. I think that the regulatory environment's getting more difficult for smaller institutions. I think that often across various jurisdictions, the regulator's setting the bar at a level now that it's expecting all financial institutions to meet, whether they're large or small. So being able to respond to that regulatory environment is really important. So that's the first thing. So, and we need to invest in our processes and our system and our people to help meet the regulatory hurdles, because we're in the business of banking, and regulation and risk management's core to our business operation. But at the same time, I think we also have a role to play to help inform the regulators around the unique work that we do in the various communities where we operate. And, whether that's around, some of our smaller members who are in that, that very sort of SME space, or in the microfinance, really working to lift people and communities out of poverty. They've got a very unique role to play in the finance system. So making sure that we have a regulatory environment that enables them to thrive is important. For others that perhaps in more developed economies, I think still engaging with the regulator to talk about whatever the social and environmental issues that exist in our parts of the world are really important. Because the other thing that we have to do is balance people, planet and prosperity. So we have to be profitable businesses to be able to reward our investors, to be able to invest in the capital, to grow the organisation, or invest in our people and systems and technology. So there's a real balance there, I think, in terms of how we manage that regulatory environment, but also drive, profitable businesses at the same time.
That's a tall order for a number of smaller banks, but really appreciate it. Maybe my last question is a little bit personal. You have been, as you said, 30 years in the in the business of working with member-owned institutions. I'm wondering what sustains you. I mean, it's to me, it's incredible that you've managed to innovate, to reinvent. Maybe share a little bit of that. What process do you go through every time you realize it's time to renew?
Okay, so I work with really good people, so that's a wonderful thing. Whether that's people in the bank, the governing board, or the executive team, I really enjoy coming to work and being present in the business. That's hugely rewarding and motivating in and of itself. Even engaging with the regulators and of course, engaging with the other members of the Global Alliance is hugely rewarding. I think one of the driving factors for me, Tom, is as a leader, I can affect change in the business, and I'm hoping that that's positive change, and being able to grow and mature as the business has developed and evolved, and to help lift the capability and the capacity of the organisation to right size the complexity, where we are in terms of our own evolution, and be part of that journey. That's been hugely rewarding for me, because it's a wonderful thing to be able to think that you can provide, positive impact and drive change and help our people who work in the business, but also help our customers. At the end of the day, our customers are our shareholders. They own the bank, and to help them achieve their life goals, whether they're a social enterprise or an organisation that provides affordable, sustainable housing, community housing, disability housing, or an ordinary mum and dad who are shifting, to renewable energy, and how we might support them around that, or a sustainably designed home, and provide safe, secure housing. Yeah, I think that's really that's probably my driving factor. Yeah.
Well, I think we come towards the end of our interview, Damien. I remember once formulating in a book that I was writing that humility comes from a good dose of being able to work on behalf of something larger than yourself, something that is audacious, that really encompasses a life worth living, and building an institution that you can be really proud of. I think your sharing with us has shown all of those things and more. It just feels like such a privilege to talk to you today and to hear your stories, and we really hope that you continue with us for a long, long time, although I know eventually you may want to hang it up. But since you're into helping the lineage along, I know there'll be great people who will follow in your footsteps. So thank you so much. I want to thank all our colleagues from the GABV Secretariat who have helped to put this together. You've been listening to Damien Walsh, the Managing Director of Bank Australia. I'm Tom Cummings, the Senior Advisor for the GABV. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.